I'm trying to say something other than okay or all right as this begins. But you know what? Too bad. It's just how it is. It's just, what is all this stuff hanging off my chair here? Oh, it must be clothing. All right, so this is Joe Haldeman's poem DX. No, sorry, it is not. It is called Brass. And this is another one of Haldeman's concrete poems. That is, the poem is actually formed in the shape of the thing. Concrete poetry has been around for hundreds of years in the Western world. There are lots of famous examples. John Herbert. I'm trying to think if that's right. Herbert is his name anyway. Can't remember his first name. I think it's John, who was a famous English metaphysical poet, 17th century poet. Did a number of these things. Like there's one that's called I can't remember what it's called, like an angel or something like that, and it's in the shape of wings and that kind of thing. So this is a brass bracelet, which is made from shell casings. So all you need to know basically about a bullet is that when you see a big full shell, the bottom part of it is brass, and then it narrows. If it's a really big bullet, it narrows, and there's a sort of the pointed part. The pointed part is actually what you're trying to get into a person. The part behind it, which is very dramatic looking, is all explosive material that drives the bullet forward. So if you fire a bullet in any kind of weapon, the bullet part, which is a slug of metal, goes flying out the muzzle of the gun, and the cartridge, the casing that has been holding the bullet up to that point and has been holding the explosive at the back, has to get popped out because you want to bring another bullet into or shell officially, because the shell is composed of two parts: the shell casing, and the bullet itself, which is the little pointed part. That's the slug of metal that you want to get into somebody. So it's the casings here that we're focused on, which you often will see in movies. You'll see they like to highlight people firing automatic weapons, and you'll see casings popping out at a great rate. Like you see them sort of spilling out. And they often focus on the brass that's hitting the floor, and you'll hear this sort of dingling sound as the brass hits the floor. The brass is most of the time in war anyway, you fire your gun and move on. And if you're in a base and you're firing your gun, the brass will be hot, and it will drop around your feet, and it just gets sort of kind of plowed into the earth basically. But they will say, police up your brass, because they don't want this is in Vietnam, they don't want the Vietnamese to pick up the brass and recast it. So it depends on what the expectations are of the soldiers, but if you hear the words police up your brass, it means basically pick up the brass leavings that are gone. You can't do anything about the bullets because they've been fired, right? And they're God knows where. So what's happening here is that it's the Vietnamese who are policing up the brass. Okay, so it's fairly common for Vietnam veterans to wear a brass bracelet. It was for quite a while. And again, this was unusual to have men wearing jewelry in the West. And this was one of the unusual things about the Vietnam veterans, that they broke this. They broke with these traditions of masculinity and so on, even though they had been to war. So this is a lot of where the poem starts. And the lead-off point is this bloody John Wayne statue, which is in Anaheim. And now you can Google this and look it up, and it's it's actually a really good statue. I mean, it's a really good likeness of Wayne. And I'm trying to remember which parts of the statue have been rubbed so often they're bright. They're bright brass. The rest of it's is developing what they call verdigris, which is really it's really a fancy way of saying green gray, but brass tends to, as it oxidizes, it tends to get this sort of patina, which is can be quite attractive. So most statues that may be bronze will get this, and they will sort of begin to weather, and that's attractive. But then if people often will touch part of the statue for good luck. And my memory is that it's the handle of it's the handle of one of Wayne's 6-shooters is one of the pieces that's touched. And I think, I can't remember if this is the star, because it's John Wayne is a sort of quintessential Western sheriff, whether it's his badge or whether it's his boot, I can't remember. But you can look it up and see. So that's where Haldeman is starting. And he's going to connect, as he does, these disparate things and unite them in ways which should cause us surprise. And this is partly why Haldeman is such a fine poet. And so the poem is set up as a series of links of a bracelet. And as you can see, the bracelet gets less and less over time of the poem, right? Which is the point. In front of the airport, eyes stealing to the east, the butt of a peacemaker. So we look at this and think, how do we read this poem? Do we read down and then across? Do we do across and down? Like, could it be either way? And in this first stanza, the 3 lines, it looks like we could read down. And that's always it's one of the reasons I love this poem. I think it's a wonderful poem. I think it's a little known gem. It often doesn't get reprinted, which I think is a shame. But anyway, do we realize is like, no, well, you have to read across. So it is a chain, and we must follow the chain. So we'll start again. In front of the airport in Anaheim, California, a brass statue of John Wayne squints brass, eyes stealing to the east, forever, staring down the faggot peaceniks, right hand curled around the butt of a peacemaker, and on his right wrist, a brass bracelet. A cartridge is primer and powder, is lead and brass, and when the firing pin slaps, then the lead sketches a flat arc in decaying orbit that ends in the ground or tin can or wood, or meat sometimes. The lead smacks home. But the brass clinks away and is forgotten, except in the land where he got that bracelet. While the wood still smelled smoke and meat, they would come so poor they'd brave the mines, the unexploded rounds, brave the sight of crusting blood, rotting bits of bodies that the soldiers left behind, to pick up discarded cans of food, belts and boots and so on, and fill a bag with brass. The profit in brass was large. The big GIs would pay $1 or $2 for bracelets you made, say 20 at a time, with the fireplace, an electric fan, a simple mold. Some would buy one for every man they'd killed, and slip through the jungle, softly rattling their scalps of brass. Mine cost a can of scrambled eggs and a pack of Winstons. I only got the one. 18 years now, it's been off my wrist twice. Both times, the first year, MASH and surgery. And never off again, until it runs out of brass. Because every time the wrist moves, a few brass molecules come off. At the end of every day, a patch of green skin signifies another micron rubbed away. It's a thin ribbon now that was a solid tube of brass. When it breaks off through and falls off, I will lose a link. So what an amazing poem this is. It's just so simple in execution. It appears to be just such a simple piece of. It's like watching a dancer. You're like, wow, that's just so perfect. And then you started to get in there and figure out how is this done, and you're like, ooh, baby, this is this is tough. So there are three things that Haldeman is bringing together here, right? The John Wayne statue, the Vietnamese who are collecting the brass itself, which is arguably, is the unifying thing, and time. So the statue, the Vietnamese, and the war in Vietnam, but the Vietnamese specifically, who are essentially the heroic ones, for collecting this stuff, and time, which is the major issue, and loss that comes with it. So the Peacemaker is the Colt, the famous Colt revolver, which was said to have made the Wild West what it was, basically. And this is so it's a 6-shooter. It's a 6-gun. It's the standard revolver that you see in most westerns that are historically accurate. And so we've got these nice plays, where so it's in Anaheim, California. Okay, so which I think it must be where Wayne was born. Now remember that his name was. Oh my goodness. This is great. And then my brain decided to, up and leave me. Marion Morrison. There we go. And then he became John Wayne, right? And Wayne was, by all accounts, this decent guy. He was fair, and he wasn't a red baiter. He didn't, he wasn't a communist, but also he didn't turn on his friends, and he treated people fairly. And during the McCarthy hearings and the witch hunts in between 1950 and 1954. But he did become the icon of the right wing, and especially during the 60s, the late 60s. And this is why I put in those two pieces from the Green Berets, because but if you want to see sort of like the quintessential John Wayne film, where he really plays this rough and tough, no nonsense sheriff. He's not sort of like the nice guy. This is not a nice guy. Have a look at The Searchers. It's John Ford, where a native, I cannot remember the tribe, steals a white girl basically from a farmhouse settlement, and Wayne and his posse go after they begin the search, basically. And this is a hugely influential film. Ford made many influential westerns, but this one is particularly. So if you want to see it, and it's oh boy, if you're looking for, if you want to see this troublesome politics, it's like you're going to see it in The Searchers. To a lesser extent, you'll see it in, say, a war film like The Sands of Iwo Jima, which was also extremely famous, and Wayne's portrayal of Sergeant Stryker is enormously famous. Okay. So that's John Wayne. John Wayne, American hero, and it's great, So John Wayne and the statue is made of brass, right? So Squint's brass, and then Haldeman can't help but play with it. Eyes stealing to the east. So it's like if you steal your eyes, or you've got a steely gaze. We don't really use this phrase much anymore, but it was sort of it was part of the hard-boiled school that you had a steely gaze. It meant that we need a bit of light in here. Hey, geez, Tim, it's like, can we get a bit of light on this? Okay, that's a bit better. Yeah, so you've got your steely gaze, so it's like, you're like, tough guy. Sitting to the east, forever staring down, and then it's like, well, by the time we get to the John Wayne, who's going to die in 75, as my memory, 75, 76, somewhere in there, I think 76, of cancer. He'd become quite right-wing, and before Charlton Heston basically had become a sort of spokesmodel for the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which, as we know, has done so much damage to the United States and has made these mass shootings possible with automatic weapons, demanding automatic weapons. Okay, whatever. So Haldeman deliberately uses these offensive words, the faggot, peaceniks, because these are the true man against the feminized men of the peace movement, who they were sort of this the equation that if you were a peacenik, you couldn't be straight, that you were effeminate because you weren't prepared to go to war. Now, what's interesting and that everybody points out about this is that Wayne never did go to war. He was too important to the war effort in World War II to be allowed to go and serve. And so he was kept in Hollywood making war films. And so, in fact, Wayne never actually served in the military. And this is one of these intriguing things. So it's like, here's a guy who essentially began to believe his own press, sort of like Robert De Niro, who, from some of the accounts I've read recently, sort of has become has played so many gangsters over the course of the last 40, 50 years, something like that, that he kind of believes he's a gangster. Okay, so it's kind of like that. Right hand curled around the butt of a peacemaker, and on his right wrist a brass bracelet. So there's this bracelet. Okay, so here's the connection. This is already a bracelet because it's link of the bracelet. And these bracelets are, sometimes they're solid, but sometimes they're made of actual little links. And the links would have themselves been forged out of brass strips that you would get by basically hammering flat a shell casing. And then there's the what Haldeman often does, which is go back to the actual, like, the reality of the thing itself, and he's dealing with the thing in itself. I'm paraphrasing the German here. So a cartridge is primer and powder, and so on, and then there's sort of like, how does this work? And the lead sketches a flat arc, which is really it's a beautiful sort of contradiction, because you can't have a flat arc. An arc is not flat by definition, but a bullet doesn't go straight because it's invariably going to drop over the course of its flight. So you actually have to, a bullet's trajectory will go up and then it will drop to its target. So there's the physics basically of ballistics, which had to be studied, and it took hundreds of years to figure this stuff out because there was basic physics, and in the 16th century they were like, why do cannonballs not get where they're going, and what's going wrong? It's decaying orbit, because basically anything you fire like that could be in an orbit of some kind. If it had enough strength and it went on long enough, it could actually be in an orbit. But in this case, it's got to stop. It ends in the ground, or a tin can, because you often, they call it plinking, or wood, or meat sometimes. The lead smacks home. Now, so the brass part of the cartridge, you want brass because it won't blow up. It's non-reactive. So even if there's a little fire essentially inside the casing, it's not going to spark a problem with the metal. It's not going. The metal isn't going to catch on fire, which you got to not have, because it'll blow your gun up. But then the piece that's at the end is lead, right? Because you want something which is soft. Now, in the last I've been talking about weapons that are illegal. One of the weapons that became illegal after World War I was a so-called dum-dum bullet. And a bullet that's been dum-dummed is a bullet where you take the tip of the bullet and a very sharp knife, and you put the very sharp knife, and remember, lead is soft, right? I mean, and you put the knife right on the tip of the bullet, and then you hammer it down very sharply, and then you make a cross, basically cut a cross like this. What happens then is that when the bullet goes in, it opens up. And this is how bullets are actually designed. The design of a bullet shape is enormously important. And so dum-dumming bullets, which was done by the men in the trenches, especially towards the end of the war, when they were really just so enraged by the horribleness of the situation. They're like, anything to kill the enemy. They didn't care. They were like, Geneva Convention, what's that? Like, we just want to kill people and get out of here. Well, dum-dumming became illegal in World War II. You were not supposed to dum-dum a bullet. That didn't stop people from doing it. By the time we get to the Vietnam War, these M16s, which are not very good rifles, unfortunately, for the men who need them for protection, have little tiny bullets, relatively. The idea is to have a smaller size, but they're set to tumbling. And a tumbling piece of metal will open up a 4 to 6 inch hole channel in the body. And they're effectively impossible you're just not going to survive that kind of thing. So that's the job, basically. So there's this whole ballistics of how bullets work and so on, which is what Haldeman is talking about. So, but we're not about the bullet, right? We're about the brass. But the brass clinks away because the brass is ejected from the gun, whatever it might be, whether it's an automatic or whether it's a machine gun, or it doesn't matter, a rifle. The brass has to go so the next shell can come in, cartridge can come in, and is forgotten, except where he got that bracelet. Where did you get the bracelet? Well, you got it in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, how did you get brass? Well, the Vietnamese came while basically there was still fresh blood and dead people. And they would brave the mines, the unexploded rounds, the sight of crusting blood and the bodies. And they would pick up food and belts. And this is standard battlefield salvage. And likely it's not the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong who are doing this, maybe, but likely it's villagers who are doing this because they need to make money because they're starving, especially by the end of the war, and they collect brass. And then they begin to hammer the brass into bracelets and ironically sell it to the GIs. So they're selling the GIs American brass back to the Americans for $1 or $2, which is a lot relatively. Say you made 25 at a time. And you would recast. So what he's talking about is, with the fireplace. So basically what you do is you get all this brass and you melt it down again, and then you recast these bracelets. And the brass bracelets they can be like trophies. If you don't want to collect ears, let's say, or you want sort of basically a number of, you want to indicate, how good you are at killing people. Somebody says, how many people have you killed? You're like, check this out. I've got an arm full of bracelets. And slip through the jungle, softly rattling their scalps of brass. So the brass becomes a stand-in for the scalp. And so here again is this concept of Indian country. And this is where the Wayne statue again takes on more significance, that Wayne is an Indian hunter. And I'm not using the First Nations or Aboriginal Americans, because we're an Indian country, and that's why they're talking about scalps. That's why he's talking about scalps. Although people did collect scalps, they collected heads, skulls, and then tended to boil them usually because they would smell so bad. And then he talks about how he got his. So a can of scrambled eggs. So remember I was talking about sea rations when I was talking about the M113As, the tracks that Casey talks about in A Bummer. Well, these sea rations, you can get a can, believe it or not, of scrambled eggs. And I gather there are a few things that are more gross. I was going to say grotesque. It is grotesque, but also gross. Just I don't know how people eat them. So he trades them and a pack of cigarettes. And he only got the one, not for a death, but just to mark the service. And it's been there, right? It's part of his life. So MASH, so a Mobile Armory Surgical Hospital, and surgery. So these 2 times that it's been off, otherwise not. And then he begins to focus on what happens when the brass wears down, which it does. And some metals are softer and more malleable than others. This is relatively soft metals. You can actually wear it away. Which is why brass is not particularly good for, say, knives. You want a steel knife because the steel is very hard. It's very durable. depending on what's in the steel. I mean, the steel is an alloy, blah, etc. It's a thin ribbon now. There was a solid tube of brass. So as the bracelet is about to fall off, there will be a loss here, a link with the past, because the bracelet itself becomes one in a chain of bracelets that connect, in this case, the veteran to Vietnam. So a very complex, intriguing, wholly made poem. Amazing.